everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the Postmodern Realities Podcast, brought to you by the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. I'm Melanie Cogdill, Managing Editor of the Christian Research Journal. It's October 2025, and this is episode 468, which is a conversation about mediums. On this episode, I'm joined by Lindsey Medenwaldt, who is an assistant professor of business and economics at Northwestern College in Iowa. She is the author of Bridge Building Apologetics and the forthcoming book, What If Jesus is Right?, which she co-authored with Dr. Douglas Groothuis. Lindsey writes extensively for the Christian Research Journal about topics involving the occult and the New Age movement. Lindsey has written an online exclusive feature article for the Christian Research Journal for her ongoing column called Fringe Files. Her article is called Channeling the Dead, A Christian Response to Mediums. You can read it for free at equip.org. That's EQUIP.org. Lindsey, it's good to have you back on the podcast.
Nice to be back, Melanie. I always love talking to you about these things.
Well, this is the second podcast that Lindsey has done for us in the month of October, because October is a month that usually when people are getting prepared for Halloween, and in my neighborhood, as I noted last time, it's even more. I mean, we have a particular house that I think I've mentioned on this podcast before. It has a lot of like animatronics that are like super disturbing, like little children in cages, and these kinds of things, people harming children in cages. So, I mean, not people, but like little, spooky things and giant. I saw somebody got a giant, almost as tall as their house, skeletons of various sizes. So it's a big thing because, of course, we're in the Halloween season in the West, particularly America. And so that brings us to today's topics, which is mediums, which is communicating with the dead through mediums. So first of all, what is a medium? I think some people might have heard of various different famous mediums that were celebrities in the past on television, like John Edwards, many decades ago, but now more recently there are mediums popular on YouTube, for example.
Right. Yeah. Mediums are not gone with the 90s or the 2000s. They are still alive and available, maybe even more so now today than they were in the past because of technology and the internet. But a medium is a person who claims to act as sort of a bridge between the world of the living and the spirit world. And they specifically communicate or talk with spirits who have died. They can receive messages from the dead through their psychic abilities, like they feel heightened emotions or through automatic writing. And some even claim they can directly speak to the dead. Not maybe like face-to-face, one-on-one, but they have that intuitive sense that they are communicating directly with a particular dead person. I think one kind of mediumship that people think about is maybe a seance. And a seance is when a group of people are together and they're usually led by a medium, and they sometimes are sitting down. That's kind of where the word seance comes from. And they try to talk to the dead together. So one example, actually a kind of famous example of someone who participated in a seance was Mary Todd Lincoln. She would host seances in the White House, and Abraham Lincoln and other leaders would join her for these seances, and they would try to talk with Mary Todd Lincoln's dead son. And so seances are not new. They have been around for quite a long time, and it's just one example of a kind of mediumship that exists.
Well, I know some of our listeners may be wondering what this even has to do with Christians. I think a lot of times on certain podcasts when we do cultural apologetics, I always ask up front, why should Christians care? Because there's Christians that are listening and thinking, I don't want to talk to the dead. I don't know of anybody that does want to talk to the dead. So why should they be concerned about this particular subject?
I think it's always good for Christians to be aware of things and to have knowledge about what the world is thinking so that we can come up with good responses. And the reality of the situation is that there are a good number of people who visit fortune tellers or psychics or mediums. It's about 22% of Americans, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it really is. It's about a quarter of the population. In a 2023 poll that was hosted by Pew Research, I think, 38% of the respondents said that they had a strong feeling that someone who had died was trying to communicate with them. And 30% believed that they had personally encountered a spirit or some sort of unseen spiritual force. And 50% said that they believe when they pass a cemetery or when they're in a cemetery that there are unseen spiritual energies that exist in cemeteries or graveyards. But then when we're looking at Christians, there is Pew does a really good job of kind of pulling out religious groups and saying what their perspectives are based on the poll. And I pulled out the information about evangelicals, but there's information about Protestants and Catholics and a lot of the different denominations. And of the evangelicals who responded, 53% said that spirits are generally both helpful and harmful. 40% said cemeteries do have unseen energies or spiritual forces. And 31% said that the dead communicate with the living. So this isn't just a non-Christian thing. There are Christians who are also buying into this. And it's about a third of Christians. And so that leaves the door open for, obviously, we must admit that Christians are engaging in these topics, and some are even visiting psychics or asking mediums to help them communicate with their dead loved ones.
Well, we wanted to revisit this topic. We are going to link this article in the show notes, but back 23 years ago, we covered it, and the article is called I See Dead People, A Look at After-Death Communication. And in that article, we did mention the past, like popular mediums, Sylvia Browne and John Edward. And that was, in the late 90s, early 2000s. But article is 23 years ago. Are these mediums still around, or ones like them?
There are lots of mediums still around. Sylvia Browne has passed away, so she's not around anymore. But mediumship is a part of the big business of psychics, and the psychic business world, or the amount of money that psychics bring in annually, it's worth about $2.5 billion in the United States, which is pretty good. That's a lot of money. And it continues to grow despite the fact that people are skeptics. You mentioned John Edward. He had a show called Crossing Over, and some people might remember a woman named Teresa Caputo. She was the Long Island medium, kind of known for her bright blonde, big hair. She had a lot of hair. She has a lot of hair because she's actually back on TV. She has a new show called Raising Spirits. And I watched a clip of her talking about the show, and she travels around and talks to live audiences and connects with people and does her mediumship with them. But I would say probably the most popular medium today is someone named Tyler Henry. He's actually pretty young. He's not even 30 years old yet. And he has found an audience with celebrities in particular. And I would say that is kind of how he's gotten his foot in the door. He's also written a couple of books already for such a young age, and he performs for live audiences. He kind of hit the scene big when he was doing his show with celebrities, and he recorded a piece with Alan Thicke, he was an actor, and he told Alan in the course of his reading to watch heart issues and his blood pressure. And so that was in August. And Alan actually died in December of that same year from a ruptured aorta, which is often caused by high blood pressure. So you had a whole bunch of people then coming in, including other celebrities, saying, oh my gosh, Tyler Henry got it right with Alan Thicke. We should think about this more closely and recognize the value of mediumship. But the actual response should have been, well, how could he have known that? As somebody who is a celebrity, right? Alan Thicke had a lot of information available on the internet, including a family history probably of heart disease. And other people could have looked that up. So I would say just because it happened, it doesn't mean that it was because of a psychic reading. I would say that we have to have a little bit of skepticism about that.
So we had a conversation earlier this month about psychics, and I'm sure people are wondering, well, aren't mediums the same thing as psychics? I mean, wouldn't you go to psychic to do the same thing, look in a crystal ball or read your, hand or do a reading for you or like talk to the dead? Or are these different types of folks?
They're similar, but not quite the same thing. I would say that the term psychic is the umbrella term, and it describes somebody who uses intuition or extrasensory perception, like we call it ESP, right, to gather information about a person, but they're not necessarily connecting with dead people or spirits. A medium is then a type of psychic who has the additional ability or gift to talk directly with spirits. So all mediums are considered psychics, but not all psychics are considered mediums. Another difference is that psychic readings often focus on predicting future events, where mediums primarily tune into things that happened in the past. Maybe they're connecting with a dead loved one and trying to have resolution on an issue that may have occurred. There's a documentary that came out a couple of years ago called Look Into My Eyes. And in that documentary, it featured several psychics from New York City. And there was a doctor who was trying to figure out if one of his patients who had died had achieved like peace in the afterlife. And there was a son who was trying to talk with his dead father, who had died in a difficult situation. And in both situations, they were trying to get resolution. And so I would say that's definitely a difference. But not all psychics are mediums. So we can't just go to a general psychic and ask them to talk to dead people, because that's probably not one of their gifts. And I want to be clear here that when I talk about these things, I'm not giving credibility to any of the claims that they're actually happening or whatever. But the way that I talk about them, sometimes I think the perception can be that I am admitting that they have some sort of gift. No, I'm just describing them as they describe themselves so that we can have some understanding about where they're coming from and what they're claiming.
Now, in the past, we've talked about the rise of some of these, different kinds of spiritualists, I guess, people who read tarot cards or people who are interested in witchcraft or, psychics. And so does mediums fall into the same category as some of these where they've seen a resurgence because of social media?
Oh, of course. I think the most prevalent place to find mediums these days is on social media. You can get several apps to help you connect with a medium, and they'll do readings for you, even through Zoom. You can connect with somebody who claims to be a medium, and they will do a reading. I read an article by a gal who connected with a medium, and they met on Zoom, and she described her experience. She was really skeptical going in that the medium was going to be able to connect with her in any way because it was through a screen. But she said that it was the same kind of situation it would have been had they been kind of across the table from each other. So that has really opened up a door for mediums to connect with more people and to get into more people's homes. And of course, you talked about, some of the old television shows or films. We're in the season when all those kinds of films are streaming, right? And so you can access The Sixth Sense, and it's getting a ton more viewers, which is allowing it to get a resurgence. Or the shows like, I think it's called Medium and maybe The Ghost Whisperer, those are both in syndication. So those shows have the opportunity to gain more followers. And of course, with reels and other things on social media, younger people are getting access and are getting interested. So it's not just a thing of the past, even though a lot of the references we might use, Melanie, are older references. Those things are still coming to light now because of technology.
It's been a while since I mentioned that one of the ways that you can partner with us is to leave us a tip. As you know, the Christian Research Journal ceased being an in-print subscription magazine about 2 years ago, but we're still bringing you all that wonderful content with a new article every week on the website equip.org, as well as the audio articles on our other podcast, Christian Research Journal Reads, which I hope you add to your podcast feed. If you go to equip.org, you can support us by giving us a tip. If you go to Journal and Postmodern Realities Podcast, you'll find a landing page for every single episode we've ever had. You can click onto any of those and scroll to the bottom and you can see a link where you could give us a tip. The tip would be maybe giving up a coffee or two at your favorite coffee shop for $5 a week or $10 a week, or maybe skipping a month of one of your streaming services to help us at the Christian Research Journal with your partnership gift. We would be so grateful. Plus, there's a lot of ways that your gift to us would be just a gift of your time. Please give us a rating or a review at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, as well as please do tell a friend about all these episodes, including this one on mediums. And now back to my conversation with Lindsey Medenwaldt about this subject. So how does somebody start out as a medium? I mean, is there any kind of course you can take or some kind of educational path to develop this skill, or what they're claiming to be as a skill, or any kind of formal training that they might have? Or is it something that's considered like someone has a gift for this particular kind of like communication with the dead?
It really depends on who you talk to, Melanie. Some people will tell you it's a gift, and some people say that it is a skill that can be learned. So for example, in Tyler Henry's case, who is the medium we were talking about earlier, he considers it a gift. And he says that he realized he had this particular gift when he was only 10 years old. And the story that he shares is that he was 10 years old. It was the middle of the night, and he woke up and he had this intense feeling that his grandmother had passed away. And so he ran into his parents' room and he said, "Mom, I just had this feeling that grandma died." And he said that there was a phone call from his dad just a couple of minutes later confirming that grandma had died. And for him, that was evidence that somehow he had a gift. Now, I approach it with a little bit of skepticism. Like, dad was with grandma, which implies that perhaps they already knew grandma was not doing well. And we talk about these things with our kids, right? Hey, we need to be prepared that these things might happen. And so it seems like maybe in the middle of the night he had a thought, and then combined that with the coincidence that his grandma had died. But for him, it is an indication that he definitely has this gift of mediumship. And he originally wanted to work in hospice care because he thought that would be a good gift to have in that area. But then he said that he just felt like being a professional medium, I guess, was a better way to go. And of course, again, the skeptic in me is, yes, there's more money to be had as a celebrity medium than somebody who spends their time working with people in hospice. And with Teresa Caputo, she also says that it's a gift, not an ability that she has created among herself, like in herself. She says that also probably a lot more people have this gift than we give them credit for. Like we all might be walking around with this gift. We don't just recognize it that way. An example that she's given is she says that dead loved ones often want to communicate with us. We just don't see it. So she said that if a dead loved one loved a particular animal, for example, that animal might show up in your life a lot after they die. And that's an indication that the loved one is trying to communicate with you. And I take that for what you will. And then there's the other side of it that says it's not necessarily a gift, although we are granted with intuition or the ability to tap into so-called energies, but it is more of something that you can learn. So there are a couple of places that offer courses. Like there's one called the Monroe Institute. It offers classes for beginners to expand their state of consciousness. And there are classes on lucid dreaming or unlocking the energy within you. And once you've done that, it gives you the opportunity to then tap into the spirit world and then perhaps communicate with the dead. Another one is actually Edgar Cayce's ARE, which is called the Association for Research and Enlightenment. You might recognize Edgar Cayce's name. He was an American clairvoyant who lived in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and he was known as the sleeping prophet because he said that he could be asleep and diagnose people of their illnesses. And so the ARE was born as a nonprofit by him in the 1930s. Today, the ARE offers classes about enlightenment and also energy and consciousness, just like the Monroe Institute. But they also have a podcast that talks about mediumship called New Awakenings. And the idea being that we can train ourselves to get into it. And finally, of course, we already talked about technology, but there are classes all over the internet about how to become a medium. I stumbled upon one that said, it's time to step into your modern day shaman. Now, a shaman is a type of medium that enters into a trance, maybe usually during a ritual, and they can tap into the spirit world and communicate with the dead. So the idea is that now as a person, you can train yourself to be that spiritual person and connect with the dead.
So you're just talking about Edgar Cayce, which we'll also link that article in the show notes for this particular episode. But you were saying that he was a clairvoyant. So you were just talking also about shaman. So are there different kinds of mediums? And if there are, can you tell us about the types of mediums? Because I don't know, is a clairvoyant the same thing? Is that just a synonym or is it actually a different type of mediums?
Yeah, there are different kinds of mediums. So usually we can split them up into two groups, and then there are different types within the two groups. There are mental mediums, and then there are physical mediums. Mental mediums are the people who maybe it's called like tuning in to the spiritual world, and they're listening or sensing or seeing spirits. It's like telepathy with dead people. So telepathy is reading other people's minds. Mental mediums can read the minds of dead people. The kinds of mental mediums that exist are clairvoyants, like you just said, which they kind of use their seeing to you might hear them say the word aura, right, a lot. So they see auras, and that helps them see the thoughts or thinking of the dead people. There's clairaudience, which is hearing. So there's actually an audible sound for them. And there's also clairsentience, which is feeling. And so those are just three types of mental mediums. They're physical mediums as well, and they are believed to produce the materialization of spirits. So they actually can bring in sounds. Like sometimes you'll see shows where they hear knocking or bell ringing or rapping, and they're like, oh my gosh, it's a dead spirit. Well, the idea would be that it was that physical medium that was allowing the dead person to communicate through sound. I would say that levitation is probably the one that people think about with regard to physical mediums. This is probably the first aspect of mediumship that I ever encountered. And it was in a film called The Craft in the 90s. It came out when I was in high school, but I wasn't allowed to watch it for good reason. And I ended up watching it. I think I might have been in my mid-20s the first time I watched it. And it's a show about young women in high school who are trying to be witches. And in the show or in the film, they have a ritual that takes place, and they start chanting a chant. I don't need to repeat that here, but they have a specific chant that they say over and over and over again. And eventually one of the characters is levitated above the ground. And that for me is a really good example of what physical mediumship would look like. You can also maybe think of the girl in The Exorcist who was levitated above the bed. So that would be an example of physical mediumship.
So we've also talked in the past about channeling, or at least people who practice channeling. Is a medium somebody who practices this, or is it something different, or is it related to people who are mediums?
It's absolutely related to people who are mediums. So channeling is when you receive information from a source that is outside of your own consciousness. And so the person who is channeling is acting like a conduit or a channel, right? Or a bridge, if we're going back to the definition of medium. And they're allowing the spirit to give information to other people through them, either through their words or through writing or some other means. And so we've talked about Sylvia Browne briefly. Teresa Caputo, it would be an example. An older example, but really relevant in the history of channeling, is Helen Blavatsky. She was the co-founder of the Theosophical Society, which was a new religious movement that was pretty popular in the US in the late 1800s. Helen claimed that she channeled a group of spirits called the Masters of the Ancient Wisdom, which was a secret brotherhood from Tibet. So if you look up channeling, Helen's name comes up quite frequently because this is one of the things that she was known for. And of course, we know that Helen was related to the occult. And we see that trend pretty frequently in mediumship as well.
So besides the ones that you've mentioned already, physical mediums and somebody who is channeling or those kinds of things, and mental mediums, are there any other types of mediums out there?
Yes. And I think it's important to note that mediums often will use certain senses that they have, especially the mental mediums. So it's not just limited to seeing or hearing, but there are mediums who will claim that they taste things from dead spirits or smell odors, maybe like a perfume that the dead person used to wear, or something different like that, that would relate to the dead person. There are also mediums who go into trances, and there are others who actually sort of become possessed by the dead person, and the dead person inhabits their bodies. I suppose the best example, and the one that comes to my mind immediately, there was a film in the 90s called Ghost. And in it featured really popular actors, Whoopi Goldberg and Patrick Swayze, and I think Demi Moore. And in it, Whoopi Goldberg plays a character who is a psychic, but she's a fake psychic, right? She's not really doing anything. And that's kind of the point of the character. But Patrick Swayze's, spoiler alert, Patrick Swayze's character passes away and gets in contact with Whoopi Goldberg's character because he wants to warn Demi Moore's character that she's in danger. And there's a scene actually where Whoopi's character is inhabited by this dead man's spirit, and he dances with his girlfriend. And it's kind of awkward to watch because it's just, Whoopi Goldberg dancing with Demi Moore, and it's not really Patrick Swayze at all. But that is an example of possession, which is when a spirit enters into a medium's body and it actually causes changes to their voice and sometimes even their appearance, not that they'll look like the dead person, but just something different happens in the state of a trance. And oftentimes the medium will claim that they don't remember it happening. So they can't talk about it because they don't remember it.
So in our last episode, when we talked about psychics, we talked about psychics who do readings. Do mediums also do readings, and are they the same kind of reading you'd get with a psychic?
I would say they're pretty similar. It isn't, I've never been to a medium, so I haven't actually experienced a reading, but I've read a lot about them. And some of the key advice that I've read about going to a medium actually has to do with before you go to a medium. And so you're supposed to prepare yourself for a meeting with a medium. And this is done by really thinking a lot about your loved one and coming in with an open mind. And I thought this was interesting, coming in with low expectations. Like maybe it's not going to happen because the dead spirit you want to talk to doesn't actually want to talk with you. Or maybe it's because the medium can't actually do it, but that's me being a skeptic and responding to that. You should have an open mind because apparently if you're a skeptic, so I wouldn't be a good fit for this. A skeptic is less likely to hear from a dead spirit because dead spirits are more likely to communicate with people who are open to being communicated with. And another thing is you should be emotionally ready because if the dead person either shows up or doesn't, that can do a lot to a person's emotions. But once you're in the actual reading, the medium will do a lot of the same things that a psychic would do and try to use their psychic abilities to connect with a person's dead loved one. And hopefully a lot of them, their goal is to provide peace or closure between the two beings, the one living and the one dead.
So also I wanted to ask you about this because I think the typical, I guess, like image that someone, if you said mediums or, somebody that speaks to dead people, kind of like the Sixth Sense kind of thing, you think in your mind of Ouija boards or that game, the Ouija board. And so are Ouija boards some kind of portal to talk to the dead? And is that something that a medium would actually, there's the board game, but is that something a medium would actually use as a tool to speak to the dead?
Ouija boards actually have a really interesting history. They became commercially available in the 1900s, but their origin is actually a lot older and it's outside of the United States. So the ancient Chinese used to use a method called planchet writing. So a planchet is that little piece that gets navigated along a Ouija board and covers over the letters, and then you get a complete sentence or thought from that. So they used to, ancient Chinese used to have something called a planchet writing, and it's like automatic writing where they would get a message from the dead and write it down. In the US, something called talking boards were pretty popular in the spiritualist movement sometime after the Civil War. And those eventually evolved into Ouija boards, which was actually named by a medium named Helen Nosworthy. Eventually, somebody saw that this could make some money, so they turned it into a game, and it was commercially marketed as a game. And even in the last 50 years, the estimate, there's no specific number on this, but the estimate is that they've sold about 20 million Ouija boards in the last 50 or so years, which is a lot of Ouija boards. For those who are still confused about what a Ouija board actually does, what the game claims is that it uses these unconscious tiny movements that is on that planchette that we just talked about. And the people holding on to it move it, and it feels like it's being done with an external force, but you've got multiple people holding on to it and using sometimes subtle movements that they're not recognizing. And it takes them through different letters and forms responses to specific questions that are asked. Do people use these? Yes, an English occultist, his name was Aleister Crowley. He openly admired the Ouija board and used it. Even people, like some Christians might be surprised about what I'm about to say, but some people like G.K. Chesterton actually used a Ouija board when he was going through his period of skepticism and investigating the occult. Now, we know G.K. Chesterton is a Christian, or was a Christian, but early on, he had gone through a period of maybe I wouldn't call it doubt, but skepticism, certainly. And while he was investigating the occult, engaged with a Ouija board. And we see the Ouija board in popular media, like Downton Abbey, for example. If we've got any Downton Abbey fans listening, you might remember watching a couple of scenes actually, where the staff was using a Ouija board to communicate with some of their dead loved ones. So Ouija boards are still popular. They haven't gone away. And they're definitely popular around the Halloween season. It's one of those things people will pull out of the game cabinet and use on Halloween night. And so that it's just still a popular game.
Now, there have been some mediums in the past who've been involved with law enforcement to allegedly and, help them solve cases. Why aren't more mediums used if some particularly different, police departments have used some? Why isn't it a more widespread practice?
This was actually, Melanie, a question that my husband asked me when he found out I was researching mediums. He's a psychologist, and he was thinking to himself, like, if mediums are real and if they're talking to dead people, it seems like they would connect with the dead people who were murdered and help them solve their own crimes. And there is a history of police departments trying to use psychics and mediums to help them. And I think of one specific example. The medium's name was Dorothy Allison, and she helped with like thousands of police investigations, not just in one place, but in all across the country. And she was part of the investigation when Patty Hearst was kidnapped. So this is back in the 1970s. And also during the Son of Sam murders, she was helping the police detectives investigate those murders. But she was later considered a fraud, and a couple of police officers admitted later that she had offered them money to say that she had publicly say that she had been helpful in solving cases. And she also, in one instance, a bunch of child murders had been happening, and she gave the police officers like a list of 42 names and said, you should look at these names, and none of them were helpful. So ultimately, and I just gave you one example, there are a few, but it seems like the generality that comes from this is that there's not a lot of evidence to show that any psychic or medium has provided information to law enforcement that has been helpful. Some have been correct, but usually it's because their insights were so vague, they would have fit into the scenario either way. And you'll find that a lot when you are listening to mediums and psychics. It usually starts out with something really vague. I was watching an episode of Tyler Henry's show, and in it was from one of his live audience ones. And he kind of pointed to a large part of the audience and said, someone in this section has a dead niece. And nobody raised their hand. And so he expanded it to the entire audience then and said, somebody here has a dead niece. Well, maybe in hundreds of people, there probably is somebody who has suffered the loss of a niece. And sure enough, somebody stood up and they communicated with each other. But I thought that was interesting, and that just kind of leads more to my skepticism about the whole situation.
Now, when they do those kinds of things that are just general, what about the episodes that people say, well, I saw that this medium talked to my dead grandmother, like everything that they knew about my grandmother was true. And, how do they explain that? How do you say that that's explained? And also, I want to know, with regard to the people who think that it is helping them understand, what are the kinds of messages that are usually given by dead people?
Well, okay. So I'll tackle the second part first. I would say the messages are generally vague because they're usually just coming from the medium themselves. And there's not a lot of information that can be provided. And of course, it's going to have to do with past information, not future information, because the person is dead and they're not living in the future now that they're dead. They're only living in their own past. It seems weird talking about this, Melanie, because I'm trying to phrase it in a way that's not lending credibility to the whole scenario, but trying to explain it and hopefully make sense a little bit. So the other side of it would be offering encouragement or maybe resolving a conflict that might have existed between the dead loved one, and the person seeking help. Usually it involves people who really want to connect with someone who is meaningful in their life. And maybe it didn't end on the best of terms, or maybe they didn't get to say goodbye. And that's why they're pursuing the help of a medium. And with regard to remind me of the first question. It was people.
Well, people are going to these, and when they, say these general messages, they're really believing that that's
Right.
what it's true. And so then what are the messages? I mean, obviously it's a multi-million, if not more, dollar business. And so there's somehow the people seeking these messages from dead loved ones think it's working, especially if you see a show or a clip and they're like, that's exactly what my grandma would say, or whatever.
Right. So for one, they're not going to show all the times that the medium got it wrong, right? Those are probably not going to hit the airwaves. I will say that in the documentary featuring the New York psychics, there was actually an instance where one of the mediums was saying something and it wasn't correct. And it was very obvious that the person that they were speaking with was like, no, that's not it. And so the medium sort of broke, we call it the fourth wall. If you've ever watched, a television show and the character starts talking directly to the camera, that's called breaking the fourth wall. And the medium starts talking to the cast or the crew and asking them, is there anybody in the room then that has this? And everybody said no. So they still showed it. It was just a documentary style piece. But when you have somebody like Tyler Henry or Teresa Caputo or Sylvia Brown, they're not going to show the times where they got things wrong or somebody didn't connect. I will say that, again, it usually starts with something vague. And then I question the times when they give demographic information. So there was a clip that I watched of Tyler Henry interviewing Jim Parsons, who's known for The Big Bang Theory. He played Sheldon. And in this interview, he asks Jim a question, and it's pretty vague, and it ends up being like the name of his grandmother. Well, celebrities have a lot of information available on the internet. And to be honest, most of us have a lot of information publicly available on the internet. And it doesn't take much to find out demographic information. So if you're going to visit a medium and you've signed up for it, let's say you filled out a form and then you're going to go, they probably have the opportunity to search you up on the internet and look for your name and look for connections. And so I would say, yes, it's possible that they're getting some information right. I wouldn't then make the leap and say that they are credibly communicating with the dead. A broken clock is still correct twice a day. And there's always the opportunity that somebody's going to get something right, or it's going to seem like they've gotten a lot right, because we are very open to suggestion. And we tend to admit more than we think we do in situations like this. And they offer, if a medium offers a very vague question and it in the remotest of ways relates to our lives, we might think they're talking to us. And in that moment, we start to give things away. So again, approach things with some skepticism.
I also want to ask you the same question that I did in our last episode about psychics, and that is, does the Bible talk at all about mediums and address it in any way? And if it does, what does it say?
Yes, it does. And it's not going to be the exact same answer that I gave you in the psychics episode, because there's actually an example from the Bible that we can use about mediums. But I will start with the Old Testament. The New Testament also talks about mediums, but in the Old Testament, we have Leviticus 20:27 and Deuteronomy 10 and 11 forbidding the practice. And of course, it's kind of lumped in with using sorcerers or witchcraft or participating in child sacrifice. But then we get this interesting narrative in 1 Samuel 28, where we see King Saul. He uses a medium to try to talk with Samuel, who had already died. Saul knew that mediumship was a sin. So in the narrative, the medium that Saul hired actually conjured Samuel. So it worked, right? It worked. And Saul communicated with the dead Samuel. But the message was not a happy message. Samuel actually gave Saul like a message of doom, because Saul died the next day. And then we get the rest of the story. This is one of the things about the Old Testament. A lot of the narrative is interwoven together, and you get a complete picture if you read a lot of the different books. And in First Chronicles, we see an kind of like the rest of the story. If we're talking about Paul Harvey and saying the rest of the story from here is found in First Chronicles, and it relates Saul's death directly with his use of the medium, saying that Saul consulted with a medium rather than trusting the Lord. And that's really kind of what we're doing when we are consulting mediums. Is we aren't seeking wisdom from the Lord, we're seeking wisdom from someone else. And then in the New Testament, we see sorcery and communicating with the spirits being condemned in Acts 8 and 9. The Bible also refers to the spirits who communicate with mediums as lying spirits, which also draws attention to Satan disguising himself as an angel of light in 2 Corinthians 11:14. So in other words, the Bible strongly warns against using mediums.
So last episode, when we were talking about psychics, you mentioned that you had a book that you were reading about how a Christian could actually be a psychic. And so, there was interest, of course, for people who are Christians to practice that and be a psychic. How about mediums? Are there also like books or other resources that suggest that a Christian could become a medium as well?
Yes, I actually consulted the exact same book I did for psychics, because there was a section on mediumship. So the book that I read is called How to Be a Christian Psychic, and it's by someone named Adrian Lee. And in it, he says that a person's experiences of the spirit world are a gift of the Lord. And Teresa Caputo, she's a Catholic. She said that she initially had a hard time reconciling her faith with her gift, but now she considers it to be a gift to be able to communicate with the dead. But with regard to the book that I read, we're clear what the Bible says, that it's unbiblical, and we're clear that Satan presents himself as an angel of light, but he's not. And the reality is that getting involved in mediumship takes you away from your relationship with God and brings you closer to the occult. And in Adrian Lee's book, I found a quote that I thought was odd on my initial reading, but I think it's really insightful. And I want to take a minute to read it, because I think it sums up exactly what's happening in his book. But it says, Satan and his minions are working to mislead us and turn us away from the gospel, but they work cleverly. They may not be solely working on us individually, but on the big corporations that sell Ouija boards in the children's section of the multinational grocery stores, or the news agencies that peddle falsehoods or hyperbole. It is what we absorb, what we see, what we are exposed to. it is important to remember that if we have God on our side, then we have no need to fear any entity or spirit, whether it has evil intentions or not. Okay, so I thought that first part was really interesting because he talks about deception, right? And Satan and the demons' desire to mislead us. But this whole book is about how to be a Christian and engage with something that is unbiblical. And I wish that he would read that paragraph of his own and ask himself, am I being deceived? Is this something that I need to learn for myself? Because ultimately, that's the case.
So, given just all of these different issues that we've talked about in the last couple of episodes, how should Christians respond to this? Is it harmless? Is it something that they should definitely stay away from? And how do they respond to other believers that it might be harmless, and why not try it out? Especially, I think for younger kids, they might just be like, well, I don't believe that Satan could talk through this board. Let's try out the Ouija board.
Or maybe they're at a Halloween party and a friend pulls one out, and how do they respond, or what do they say? That's constantly in my mind when my girls go over to friends' houses. What might they be exposed to, and what will they respond with? But I think the number one thing is to recognize that the Bible draws a line in the sand when it comes to Ouija boards, and there are literally no biblical passages that endorse, or not just Ouija boards, but mediumship, endorse or permit consulting psychics or mediums or other occultic figures, right? Christians should not engage with mediums or use Ouija boards, not even for like fun, right? I've heard of bachelorette parties, like hiring psychics or mediums to come in and give a reading to the people in attendance. Like as a Christian, I would probably make a decision not to go to that. And I would not participate if it was something that happened at a Halloween party. As with other things, if your family or friends are engaging with mediums, maybe you're not, but you have a family member or a friend who is, you should respond with gentleness. And if they're a Christian, you should definitely point them to biblical passages about this topic, right? You should be aware that some Christians just don't know, and they're not told this one way or another. The message hasn't reached them. This is why we keep doing podcasts about these topics, because we saw in the statistics I read earlier, like a third of Christians might be consulting with mediums. And that's a lot of Christians. So responding with gentleness and a true desire to ask questions and learn and say, hey, have you thought about this, would probably be the best way to go. You should also be aware, maybe your friend is not a Christian, and so the biblical route won't work. You could warn them about the potential for fraud, because fraud is a really big part of the psychic industry. It has been proven that psychics can gain a lot of information on someone through really ordinary means. Like today, technology is so easy. It's so easy to access all of the information just using a telephone number. Right? We can get addresses and dates of birth and marriage and family members from really simple information. So if somebody is telling you they're talking to your dead loved ones, you should probably respond with a healthy dose of skepticism when you hear that. Psychologists have said that mediumship is likely either fraud, or mediums are using the power of suggestion or even illusion and lies to make the person feel like it's real. And then there are the cases, even like with Saul, right? There are the cases where psychics and mediums are actually in touch with spirits, but we need to recognize that they're being deceived and being told that those spirits are good spirits. The Bible condemns contacting the spirits, and we don't know who are they connecting with. Are they connecting with your dead Uncle Harry, or are they connecting with a demon? We don't know. And we need to be really careful about engaging in that way. It's one of the reasons why I believe the Bible warns so strongly against it, because we are opening ourselves up to so many other things when we're engaging with this. And people who claim to be mediums and psychics who also claim to be Christians may not know the depth of just what they're doing. And so you could try to be a godly influence in their life or try to redirect them in other ways and show them scripture and say, maybe this has been, mishandled so far in your life and no one's ever really explained it to you. But personally, you should always be on guard and ask God for wisdom in all things.
Well, this has been a very interesting conversation. And now, on a much lighter note, whether you do the church trick or trunk and decide maybe instead to stay at home and pass out candy in your neighborhood, what is your favorite kind of Halloween candy? Because we're all inundated by it at the store, so we usually pick up some bags. So what do you reach for?
Yeah, it's usually chocolate of some type. I'm not that picky.
Well, no candy corn for you, it sounds like. Well, thanks for being a guest again, Lindsey, on the Postmodern Realities Podcast.
Thanks, Melanie.
You've been listening to episode 468 of the Postmodern Realities Podcast, brought to you by the Christian Research Journal. Today's guest was Lindsey Medenwaldt. She has written an exclusive online feature article for her Christian Research Journal ongoing column called Fringe Files. Her article is called Channeling the Dead, A Christian Response to Mediums, and you can read it for free at equip.org. You won't want to miss out on subscribing to the other podcasts from the Christian Research Institute. We have the Bible Answer Man podcast, which is published Monday through Friday with the best of the week on Saturday. It's hosted by CRI President Hank Hanegraaff and is available wherever you get your favorite podcasts. In addition, Hank has a podcast called Hank Unplugged. Hank takes you out of the studio and into his study to engage in free-flowing, essential Christian conversations on critical issues with some of the most interesting, informative, and inspirational people on the planet. And you won't want to miss out on the brand new podcast from the Christian Research Journal. Christian Research Journal Reads presents audio versions of Christian Research Journal articles. It was a print incarnation of almost 45 years. It's now on the web, as you know, with new articles every single week. So you won't want to miss these audio articles of some of our most popular and most accessed articles on our website, equip.org.